One of the biggest topics that's come up in every single Q&A session on every single panel discussion is CBAM. It affects us across the board and enters into so many different areas in aluminium at the moment. So I'm really delighted to welcome an expert panel to hopefully give us some more clarity around what's actually coming in 2026. Our moderator is Jérôme Lucas, the founder of Fast Forward Zero, and our panelists are Sharma Patel from Fastmarkets, Antoine Chacun from Odo Metals, Clément Silva from Osrich, and Leah Viktorek from StoneX. So welcome to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning. Another session on CBAM, the hot topic. I did a quick stat yesterday. 50% of all the questions were about CBAM. And it seems that with the talks I had with people, at the drinks yesterday, there's still many questions and still a lot of the keywords, uncertainty, right? I've heard loopholes. I've heard so many words that put a question on CBAM. Inefficient was also a keyword. So I'm super glad to have a panel on super high expertise on CBAM. So I'll start with Antoine from Odo. What I would ask you, just you name your name and title, but just give your connection to CBAM. I mean, your history with CBAM, just in a few words.
Okay. Then Antoine Chacun, I'm the director of Odo BHF Metals. And our connection with CBAM is our business is to supply European industry. Then we bring aluminium into Europe. Europe has huge deficit, like 5 million tons. And then we will be in the front line if it happens, the CBAM of this question. And we thought, it's a big risk for industry. We thought we can't just take the cost and say it without looking at it. Does it make sense? What is the risk for that? And that's what we would like to discuss today.
Thank you, Antoine. To Clément. So Clément, you are a young entrepreneur and you created a company that is actually focused on CBAM.
Absolutely.
Osrich.
Absolutely. So actually, I'm one of the founders of Osrich. So we are specialized in giving CBAM consultancy. We accompany smaller smelters all over the world to make sure that they know at which sauce they are being cooked in the European Union. So what will be the challenges, how the reporting challenges, and in counterparty, we take that advantage to also take some part of their allocation of the smelting capabilities. Yes.
Thank you, Clément. Now to Leah, you also have a strong connection to CBAM, your VP Carbon Market at StoneX.
Yes, I sit at StoneX Carbon Desk, and my team is looking at a number of carbon markets, the voluntary carbon markets, but also a number of compliance markets, including the EU ETS. And I guess that's also how the connection with CBAM came. So we're focusing a bit more on how can corporates manage the price risk associated with CBAM rather than, I would say, the reporting around CBAM.
Thank you. Let me move now to Shamal from Fastmarket. You're kind of the data guy, huh? I understand.
Yeah, well, I'll try and live up to that. So I'm Sharma Patel, head of modeling for Fastmarkets Carbon. Have been working with my colleagues on a range of voluntary and compliance carbon market offerings for the last year or so. On the compliance side, we've been focusing on EU ETS and the CBAM and trying to bring transparency to what the potential costs could be, what trade impacts could look like, and working with our aluminium team colleagues on ways in which CBAM could translate into Premier as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamal. So CBAM is not the first discussion and panel, and it was a workshop on the first day on CBAM. So here what we said we would focus not on the technicalities of CBAM that I'm sure many of you knows, but more stepping back on where we are in terms of policy, what still need to be defined, what are the issues, big topic, issues for the European industry, issues for the non-European industries, what is likely to happen in the future in Europe, outside Europe, and what we would like to happen. So that will be kind of the flow of our discussion, but please interact. You will have an opportunity to ask questions through Slido. I think, Sophie, you will put maybe the QR code soon. So I'm sure you may have questions, so please write your questions and we'll interact with you with that. So I'll start with the issues. So obviously, as you know, CBAM was a great idea, introduced at the beginning. I remember the first inception study in 2020 that was supposed to create a mechanism while the industry is already paying, in Europe, paying tax on the energy and also the aluminium industry above threshold. So Europe said, okay, we want to protect our industry and to stimulate the decarbonisation of the world. So let's make a mirror mechanism where importing goods will have to pay the same kind of tax as the local producers. That was the scheme, right? So now, is this scheme is likely to achieve its goal? That's the key question. Yeah. So it's a question for Antoine first.
Okay. Now, in terms of goal, I think CBAM has been designed for different products. Some are more local, like if you compare to steel, aluminium in Europe, we have a deficit, and we only produce with Norway and Iceland 3 million tons, but we use 8 million tons. Then we've got 5 million ton deficit, and we buy these 5 million tons globally. It's totally different from steel, where the balance is more or less balance between supply and demand, and the market is largely local. Then you understand that the impact of this CBAM, that's on scope 1, will only change flows, actually. And actually, anyway, part of the consumer Europe is bought externally. But there is another consequence of that. That is much more serious. It will make the price of aluminium in Europe higher. Then what you have to say is, do we gain something in terms of decarbonization of the planet? It's very limited, and we do that on a daily basis. But does it affect our industry? It's not negligible. We can come back in the figures on that if you want a bit later. Because it actually acts as a tariff. It's actually a tariff with all the problem of tariff on raw material. Tariff on raw material, they make your industry less competitive, and you create the risk of relocation outside Europe. And that's what we want to look at in depth.
Exactly. I mean, if I could add to that.
Yeah, please, Clément, maybe if we can go more deeper into the what we call loopholes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, what incentives are we creating by already taxing the imports? Of course, we are focusing in the aluminium industry on raw materials, and there is this biggest loophole is, of course, the downstream products, because at the end of the day, all the manufacturers here in Europe, they have to comply with strict rules on carbon, and if they put their end material at the end of the day, so it's carbon taxed, okay? But when you are importing already semi-finished or finished products into European Union, then it's free, it's carbon free, because you are not taxed at all. So this is creating the wrong incentives. Fortunately, the Commission has already knows about this issue. They should issue, so increase the scope by 2027, 2026 or 2027, they should say something about it, or at least try to include it, because if not, we are giving the wrong incentives. What will be the incentives? It will be, okay, we will delocalize, we'll make our production outside of Europe, because it's much cheaper, and we will not be, and we will be more competitive. So this is one of course, of the big loophole. Maybe another one, if we could touch as well, is what is the definition of this of the primary aluminium? Of course, we use these HS codes, but we are actually focused on the origin, and the origin, what is it? It's the melted, if it has been smelted, it's not if it has been smelted or melted. That's the problem. So it means that if we transform a little bit, the product, the raw material, into another country, and in this country they profit to have, I don't know, because according to what is coming up, it's going to be country standard, country benchmarks, which will be given to each country producer of raw material. If they can manage to export in those countries, which is much lower than the origin, then maybe they could potentially also find this loophole and actually import into the European Union by rebranding it, finally, the product. So this is also a major loophole, which I hope will also be addressed. And maybe also the scrap is also another one, because scrap, of course, it's also carbon-free into the European Union. So this also incentivizes much more, of course, secondary aluminium remelted products. And I think some of the big smelters, they have already seen that there is a huge incentive to actually monetize actually the scrap business, to develop more secondary billets, for example. And because, of course, there is much more incentive to import that material into Europe.
Do we see already so-called primary aluminium with recycled content coming in?
The thing is, you have the pre-consumer scrap, right? So this pre-consumer scrap is actually, it's primary aluminium. So the problem is, what is the data? That's the thing. Who is verifying the data? At some time you can say, okay, we have 20% of this pre-consumer scrap, which is basically primary aluminium, so high quality aluminium. So as soon as we will not have these accredited verifiers and some people which will be actually make sure that the production is complied, I think there is a big danger. I'm not saying it personally, but why is it preventing producers from doing that, right?
And maybe we should add that the Commission says they will include the downstream product into CBAM. But at the time you start to say, how do you do that? I take an example that everybody has. Rod is in the scope. Cable are not today. But there is one HS code for cable. Whether as I made aluminium or copper is the same HS code. If you take a bike, it's the same thing than one HS code. And the feasibility of including the downstream product is very, very improbable, unlikely. Then you promise you, and then already when you start to discuss how will you include the downstream product, they tell you, we know we don't have the traceability, we don't know how much aluminum is in that, then we put a standard rate, but a standard rate doesn't mean anything. Then we start in something where the big burden will be on the first transformation of aluminum, and the rest will be tempted to buy outside Europe. That's the risk.
Absolutely. Same thing for the bike, for example, there is a cheese code for the bike.
Yes, they say 5 kilogram aluminum, 5 kilogram steel, 5 kilogram carbon, but doesn't mean anything.
I think the Americans, they have done, they tried to pass this FPFA, so this Foreign Pollution Fee Act, so type of CBAM in the US. And they have this interesting, so they have this definition of aluminium by being where it was smelted and where it was melted. So this is extremely important because you can really trace the origin. And secondly, what they want to do, which I don't know the feasibility of it, but each product, they want to include all, of course, the downstream products, finished products, but they want to know the weight. What is the weight of the aluminium? I don't know if it's something feasible or not. I guess it's a hassle in terms of compliance, but maybe it will create a lot of jobs.
Well, thank you, Clément. We'll come back on the kind of international impact of CBAM and what is likely what does it mean for the industry outside of Europe and how the regulation, also international regulations can react. But I'd like to turn also to Leah. You're more experienced with the practicalities of the implementation of CBAM with your customers. So can you? There's been a lot of talks already about that. But if you can maybe summarize the issue and open for discussion and also for the questions.
Sure. Well, I think the implementation of CBAM has been quite messy. And I think large part is because there's still so many uncertainties and so many unknowns. Like the EU has kind of put a regulation in place, but I think, again, so many things like the benchmarking is all unknown, which makes it really hard for corporates to really prepare themselves for CBAM, and I would say takes much more effort than it should. Now, we talk to different kind of industries that are all, I would say, at different stages on how far advanced are they in their CBAM preparations. And I think the first one is always really to understand what is actually going to be your CBAM obligation and to establish an emission tracking system. And I think for certain industries, this alone is a very complex process because all of a sudden you have to engage with all the suppliers. Again, it depends how complex your supply chain is, how well prepared are the suppliers that you're dealing with. That also depends largely on the regions where you're sourcing your products from, and again, the industry that you're in. And I think that really adds to the complexity. I think on the good note is we've seen a lot of new service providers popping up in the market that are really focusing on, guiding corporates along this process, specifically on CBAM. And I think that's been really helpful. I would say with some of the corporates that are more advanced on the understand your exposure and tracking your emissions, we do have some early conversations on how can they actually hedge the price risk for CBAM, where obviously we're having a few conversations on how can you use the EU ETS for that, and what are the options that they're having.
Thank you, Leah. And now I would like to understand better the impact on the international market. So there's a lot of complaints in Europe. Yeah. I hear that. But we can maybe take also the perspective of the others, right? We need the the imports in Europe. We need the imports. So 4 million tons of
5 million, yeah.
5 million tons of import are needed, of primary aluminium are needed into Europe. So what's the perspective? So what do you see in terms of international developments on this front?
Sure. So some of the analysis we've done on this suggests the cost to those importers across aluminium could be somewhere in the region of 1 billion euros by 2030. Which is relatively material, and the incentive, and that's based on current trade flows, I should add. Of course, if there is trade shuffling and people are moving some of the low carbon metal in and pushing the high carbon elsewhere.
So 1 billion euro to be paid by the importers for the goods into Europe.
Yes, in 2030.
In
that's right.
27.
2030.
2030.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with already.
We're already, based on that analysis, we're already partway down the sort of ramp down of free allowances, which of course makes a very big difference in the first few years. And what that will start to do, in our opinion, is it will start to sort of create this incentive to push lower carbon tons, lower carbon metal into the European market and higher carbon metal elsewhere. So alongside the kind of typical factors that are influencing the flow of metal, like quality and type, carbon is becoming a factor now as well. And there's a bit of a premium starting to form there potentially between the European duty paid, which will include CBAM, and premier elsewhere in the world, which of course won't. And of course, all of this is very dependent on some of the loopholes that Clément and Antoine have mentioned here as well. So if the issues around scrap are not addressed, then potentially very significant volumes of scrap-based product could be coming in, and primary metal could be sort of diverged into international markets as well. And unless some of the issues around downstream production are addressed as well, the implications could be less primary metal flowing into Europe, of course, more downstream product and primary production happening elsewhere and value add being done elsewhere. Maybe just to touch on a little bit of the positive side in terms of foreign policy. So my colleagues mentioned the FPFA in the US, but there's also sort of carbon price regimes being developed in regions like Turkey, China, India, which in some cases, there's a bit of a direct link in the case of Turkey with what's happening in the European market, but there's certainly influence from the action that European policymakers are taking in the international context. And really, in some ways, that is a step towards the ideal. In an ideal world, we would not need CBAMs. We would have domestic carbon pricing in every jurisdiction, and those tax revenues would be recovered in Turkey, India, and China, and CBAM would be much less of a concern in all of our minds.
I know, Antoine, you wanted to react to
No,
that?
just
I have first just a question on on Shamal on the likely increase of the duty paid in Europe. I mean, I'm sure you've done hundreds of model assumptions. So, what is the range? I mean, it depends on many assumptions. You will tell first, but give numbers.
Sure.
For the audience, not for me.
I have my small book of statistics here, and I'd be remiss if I wouldn't say none of this, of course, represents a Fastmarkets projection at this point. There's a lot of uncertainty, of course. But somewhere in the region next year of maybe 10 to 60 USD per ton, and our analysis suggests by 2035 it could be anywhere up to sort of $200. A lot of assumptions underlying this, of course. A very big one here is kind of what happens in terms of trade flows. These numbers are based on trade flows being static. Of course, if a lot of trade shuffling happens.
And 200 will be only with the current scope, which is scope 1. Antoine, you have a lot to say.
Just we had different methods, but we come to a very close result. Just, of course, I said it again, but everybody knows that these tariffs are always paid by the local consumer, not paid by the people who sell it. Then they're reflected in the duty paid premium, and I think Fastmarkets was right to include it in. That's the way it works. But if you do a quick calculation of what it will be in 2034, when the CBAM will be full, the marginal producer on scope 1 is probably around 2 tons. It's a bit 2.3 tons, then 2 tons. If the carbon price stays what it is today, about 75 euros per ton, then the cost per ton, what is reflected in the market, is 150 euros per ton of aluminium. And for the whole industry, if you use the 8 million tons, the whole industry will pay 1.2 billion, and we're very close to the figure of Shamal, each year, additional cost. Then the challenge, are you able to pass this cost downstream? That's the question, and we don't have satisfactory answer on that. But clearly, of course, that's like a tariff, the consumer pays, not the importer.
And Antoine, we're talking about here assumptions about increased cost with the current scope of the CBAM, which is only on the scope 1 emissions, so the emissions that occur at the smelter, so the emission at the electrolysis only. I know there are talks about possible, in the future, implementation of also a CBAM that would include the total emission of the product, including the scope 2 emission, the emissions coming from the electricity. And the European Commission is clear about that it will not come in the short term, because it will come only when the European grid is fully decarbonized, and when also the third-party countries will have opportunities also to decarbonize their electricity. But what if? Scope
Okay, wait your calculation. But
sure,
what we think the marginal, on present context, the marginal importer, in case you go for scope 2, will be probably gas-based. We think you can probably eliminate any smelter with coal-based. There is enough gas-based or low carbon-based smelter to supply Europe. Then it will be 8 tons. Then what was 2 tons before would be 8 tons. Then you come in with a cost of more close to 4 billion. Of course, it won't be. Of course, it will trigger regulation outside Europe. But that's the type of risk. Of course, it multiplies the risk by 4. That's what you get in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and we have a very similar number. We're 4.7 on including the indirect. But one tension there, I think, which the Commission has already recognized, which is maybe where they've delayed this, is sort of how do they compensate for the high power prices in Europe that you touched upon versus the additional cost of the CBAM, right? And every European producer will be paying those higher prices, whereas if you have power purchase agreements outside of the European market, or you're not sort of fully paying the emissions intensity reflected in your grid, then you might have a comparative advantage as a non-EU producer.
Join Slido and ask your question. This is a unique chance. You have such an esteemed panel of experts here on CBAM. Maybe I'd like to come back a bit on the international consequences, and you just mentioned about the potential reaction coming from the US, but what do we see in the rest of the world? Was Clément, you want?
Maybe yes, I could.
And after Shamal as well, or you have also Leah? Okay.
I mean, there is some retaliations measures, of course, because we are actually taxing, and this tax is actually staying in the European Union, maybe being reinvested. We don't know exactly, and so potentially some green projects. But I understand for some countries, okay, we have to make a measure to try to tax it already before it's been exported. So once it arrives into the European Union, it can be offset, right? So Brazil, for example, it's on project to do such type of scheme. Coming back also to China, of course, China was not very happy with the CBAM because for them it's also a form of green protectionism. And so, of course, they have their own emissions tradings, and I think it's the biggest emissions trading market.
And aluminium has been included into it. Beginning of this year. Huh?
Absolutely, yes. And which is interesting. But of course, the aluminium business is a bit different into China. We are not. China is not that affected for the aluminium so far because there is no really exports from raw material or primary material outside of China. What do they export? It's finished material. Fantastic. It's carbon free. So yes. So this is also one of the feedback. Of course, Turkey, UK, of course, is doing this UK CBAM. 2027 should be implemented, reporting plus tariff. So what they try to do is, of course, to link, of course, it to CBAM, because, of course, the EU CBAM is the precursor. It's the first market. So this is high potential that it's actually going to be linked. The same for Turkey. Serbia has also, I think, also created their own, wants to also to create their own emission scheme so they can also compensate their exports to the European Union. Well, that's few countries, Taiwan as well, which has joined and would like as well to imitate the EU CBAM because they want to also to have closer links with the European Union. So yes, that's the few of the consequences of the CBAM.
Thank you, Clément. Leah, you wanted to add on
I
this
think I just
point
wanted
as well,
to add,
and then the questions are coming. So.
I think there has definitely been a lot of international criticism, especially from developing countries on CBAM and on the taxation. But I think, as Clément said already, we see a lot of countries that are now really prioritizing to establish a carbon pricing, which I think is a really good thing. Specifically, if we look into the APEC region, we see South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, China, all those countries really pushing ahead. And I think also some of the initiatives that those countries do are actually quite helpful because I think specifically, for example, in South Korea or in the UAE, we've seen that the government has done a lot of capacity building on CBAM, where they're actually aiming to support the suppliers in really getting prepared for that. So I think that that's really meaningful in shifting awareness to the subject.
Jamal, you wanted also to comment on that?
Sure. I think Leah and Clément have covered a lot of very, very good points here. But one thing maybe to link into Clément's point around the different schemes is some of the complexity that comes with how the kind of charge on carbon is done. So the US scheme, I believe, is based on national average assumptions for emissions. The EU is, at the moment, facility specific. Which can potentially create a lot of issues in terms of sort of re-import and export and the flow of material around the world. The EU wants to avoid double charging by kind of giving a sort of effective rebate on the number of certificates required for the carbon price already paid. But the more kind of different mechanisms and different interpretations of the policy there are, the more complex it gets.
Thank you, Shamal. Questions are coming here, so let's take them one by one. Is imported aluminium taxed when the imported emissions are below the benchmark value? Maybe it's for you, Shamal, no?
Sure. So the way the CBAM calculation works is you get free allowances based on the benchmark value and the CBAM factor, which is the proportion of free allowances that are given. So next year that will be 97.5%. So if the benchmark is 2, then you would get 1.95 certificates per ton of metal. So it depends on whether your emissions intensity is below that level or not just the benchmark, but the benchmark times the CBAM factor. And that CBAM factor will fall over time because the free allowances will be phased out in line with what's happening in the ETS. So that importance will sort of grow over time, and you'll have to be further and further below the benchmark over time in order to not have a CBAM charge.
For 2034? Yes. Absolutely. So after that, you will be taxed. That's basically that rule.
Thank you. The next question is about what is the impact of CBAM, which is on scope 1 on the maybe downstream industry. Who wants to take this one? Maybe you, Antoine.
Yeah, I think something that, as you say, the downstream industry is not taxed yet, and you stop with HS cost 7601. Then everything down is not taxed. I think some of us work in automotive industry. You know, we're fighting for markets sometimes for 1% difference in price. Then you could have very quickly some parts that are relocated outside Europe. Then I can't give you a figure, but it can happen much faster than European Parliament think. They think they have time. If you start to tax the upstream, you have no time. Year after year, you can decide to put production outside. And this will come from the OEM who say, I'm under pressure, I need to buy the cheapest price possible. Then that could be very fast, actually. And then the other thing that you want to say, CBAM, you know, probably some of you have read Mario Draghi report about Europe industry. He says the weakness is competitivity, CBAM, Earth competitivity, over-regulation, so it's a part of over-regulation, and unpredictability. So the other question is, all the CBAM cost is related to the carbon cost that you can't really predict. You can hedge maybe, but predict it is difficult. And we can't give you a figure how much there will be a reshoring, but that's an immediate and quite sizable risk.
And delay maybe in investments.
Yes, also, yeah, absolutely, before you know what is the final scope.
Thank you, Antoine. A big question here. There was, why scope 2 is not included at this time? A big one. Who wants to take this one?
I don't have the answer, but when we started to discuss, I think there is an awareness that there is a problem with aluminium with CBAM. And from the discussion we had, we got the impression that they didn't want to go back too much. They wanted to keep aluminium politically, and they say it's a mistake, then we only keep scope 1. But maybe you have a different impression.
Yeah, no, one thing is, of course, I think European smelters are not ready for scope 2. That's maybe one of the things. So maybe they said, okay, let's delay it a bit before we actually really destroy our aluminium industry. Yeah. That's maybe
But what is very contradictory is quite, because the low scope 1 has sometimes the higher scope 2, as you know, when you select.
So exactly.
We live in total contradiction.
And it's also the fact that Europe has not a unified way of compensating the industry for the indirect emissions, and it would be very difficult to put a harmonized baseline against which tax the imported goods. So that's also a reason. So that's why Europe says will not import or will not include scope 2 unless the European grid is almost fully decarbonized. So it will take a few years. So we don't expect scope 2 to be included, within the next years. Next questions. Any takes on EU's announcements made this morning? Oh, that's a technical one. To push the sales CBAM certificate to 1st of February 27 instead of 1st Jan 26.
Maybe
Leah.
Yeah, I can start. So the sales of the CBAM certificates has been postponed to 1st February 2027. However, it will still be required for emissions in 2026 to purchase those CBAM certificates. So basically the way it will work is for the first year, 2026, you can purchase the certificates in 2027, and the price for those certificates will be based on the quarterly average of the EUA auctions after the first year, so in 2027, so for your 2027 emissions. If you then purchase CBAM certificates, the pricing mechanism will slightly change, and it will be based on the weekly average of the EUA auction price. And I think EEX has just also launched some reference pricing for that might be quite helpful to monitor the CBAM certificate pricing.
Thank you, Leah. We have another question with CBAM, which covers only the direct emission. Do you think it will actually have an effect on flows? Given the spread of emission is relatively narrow, that's true. So who can comment? Maybe Shamal, you have a view on that because you have all the data.
It's a very good question, and as I think Antoine noted earlier, there's this sort of perversity that comes with the direct emissions differences across producers, often flipping if you added the indirect on top. Like, can be very efficient on direct, but then have a very high grid intensity. The data is very sparse on the direct emissions intensity differences based on the CBAM calculation methodology at present. The research that's been done suggests the spread isn't huge, but there is a spread, and it is still material enough to kind of drive some of these trade flow shifts that we've been discussing and to have an economic impact. I think the worry around potential inclusion of indirect, although it's a few years away, might be that it kind of completely upturns those relative orderings of producers, which is something that would need to be thought about at the point at which that kind of shift would happen.
Yeah, it's sizable. Generally, you will consider that duty-free producer will go to Europe because they don't pay the 2% tax. But if a duty-free producer has 2.5 scope 1, the level that you will pay in CBAM is higher than the difference duty paid. Then it can really change the flow very quickly. No impact in global emission, but the flow can change very fast. This CBAM, because you see if a smelter has a problem with emission and go to 2.5 or 2.3, suddenly it's not yet competitive for Europe. Then yes, it can change flow.
I think there are some brands which will never be seen anymore in the European market.
Also, we won't give the names, but we try it here. Yeah, which is sad also because it stops some
and they have a
cooperation with some with some African countries that we work many times on. The cost is too high. Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is also more technical, with a focus on scope 1. How much more efficiency can be found in smelting technology, which is possible in current only by technology advancements?
You're the expert.
All right, I'll take it then. I mean, yeah, that's a good question because the room to maneuver is actually quite limited in significant technology advancements. You know that the inert anode is kind of the magic next technology that is expected to come to almost zero scope 1 emission, but it's not likely to become commercially available within at least the next 5 years. No, do not expect this to be 2035, could be, or not before that. Now, there's still room for companies who are above, let's say, the limit of the current technology with carbon anode is 1.4. Perfect, super efficient, no what is called PFC emissions, which, I mean, when you don't run well a smelter, you have perfluorocarbon emissions, which have a very high warming potential compared to CO2. So this is what a smelter should absolutely avoid. So there are many smelters who are not at zero PFC, and most of them are. So this is really where the room to maneuver is. And in order to do that, you control what is called the anode effect. So it's really about a super proper management of the smelter, of the anode, changing the anode when it's the right time. So it is about management discipline, and so there's room to maneuver here, and that's clearly the key point.
Well, what we receive, the statistic for a smelter is very stable. What we see from time to time is sudden deterioration with an accident or something unexpected, but except that, you're right, we see some progress, but not very fast. It's very much technology driven.
And you need heavy investments in new infrastructure in order to really significantly, I mean, for those that we have huge problems of PFC emissions,
Next, what would be the tax on EU-produced primary metal with higher CO2 content? So it's more about, it's not CBAM, but what is the tax that the EU producer has to bear with higher CO2 content? Who wants to answer this one?
Maybe I can start off. So that the EU-produced primary metal, of course, would be covered within the scope of the EU ETS, so it would be subject to the usual considerations in terms of receiving free allowances and then having to pay above the benchmark emissions intensity, the 1.4 number multiplied by the free allowances less the emissions that are actually being incurred. So, calculation methodology, very well known, something that has been part of EU climate policy for going on sort of 2 decades now. I think the kind of comparability of what that tax works out as once you factor in, power prices in Europe as well versus the CBAM is something that still needs to be seen. And I think this links to the benchmarks question, but until the CBAM benchmarks are fully known, it's difficult to do that kind of like-for-like comparison as well.
I
Thank
think
you.
Maybe just to add, I think obviously the free allowances within the EU ETS for those entities are supposed to be phased out until 2030. There has been recently some lobbying around delaying that. Whether that will happen or not, I think is still a bit up in the sky, but I think it's also just maybe taking one step back, I think it's quite important to also look a bit and spend a bit of time on the EU ETS because it is a very volatile market. So if you will be buying CBAM certificates, you should really look into what's going to happen to the pricing, because I think there has been maybe 1 or 2 days ago that likely the EU carbon price will be the highest carbon price in the world.
Mm-hmm. Next, when the benchmark will be known?
Everyone's guess.
Tomorrow, 2 o'clock.
By the end of the year, they said, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, I think some say by the end of the year, some say beginning next year, so I think we will see.
Okay. No more question? Then I promised to my dear panelists a surprise question. So here you go. Here's the surprise question. So I'll ask my panelists to close your eyes, right? You are in 2030, okay? You have done a lot of work on CBAM, okay? And what would you like, the CBAM topic to be like in 2030? Or the optional question is, what would you like to be proud of to have made in 2030? Who wants to? A quick one. That can be
quick one. No, just taking the primary mission globally for the aluminum sector in Europe. First, something to keep in mind that is forgotten is aluminum sector globally is about 2.2% of the global emission. It's not negligible, but it's Europe has better emissions than the average of the world. Then we want to reduce quota. We want to put a CBAM tax in Europe when actually we're already greener than the average of the planet. On this 2.2 emission, more than half of it come from the electricity used for the smelters. On this panel, it's only the coal-based smelter that issue probably 75% of this. Then if we want to contribute, if Europe wants to contribute in a free market to the decarbonization, to the lowering of emissions, there is only one thing to do, is produce more aluminium in Europe to have an energy policy where we reduce our deficit. And I think that's the way you can have an efficient action on reducing emission of aluminium sector. Then it starts with the energy policy.
So
Thank you, Clément.
bigger investments in the renewables, maybe going a bit back to the nuclear energy because it's still the greenest. Yes, some hard questions that everyone has to face because, I mean, it's good to wish to decarbonize, but you have to have to set the real targets. What will be the ideal world will be the world without CBAM, the world where there is emissions market for everyone and everyone pays for their free externality so far. So that's the main...
a globalized ETS.
Exactly.
Or interconnected ETS market. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Leah?
Yeah, so obviously I'm sitting at the carbon desk and I'm looking at global carbon markets. So I think in an ideal world, I think we would have carbon pricing that's across all different kind of jurisdictions, which kind of then means we don't really need a CBAM anymore, which would be unfortunately a very ambitious goal, but let's see where we are.
Thank you, Leah. Shamal, you have the concluding word.
So many good answers already. I think power sector investment is a bit of a no-brainer. Like, it cuts across so many of the topics that have been discussed, not just on this panel, but over the last few days as well. AI, aluminium, all of them, the underlying theme is if you make power cheap, then good things happen. But definitely echo Leah's point as well around, we'd like to talk about CBAM less, and the route to that is having climate policies everywhere in the world, right? So, yeah, that's the dream.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shamal. They merit a round of applause. Thank you. And thank you for the good questions as well.